Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. We're recording out of normal sequence this morning because, as Donald Trump might say of America, I will say of Kenneth Pollack, he's so hot right now. A year ago, he was dead, but now he's like so hot right now because Iran is in the news, and I wanted to get up to speed on Iran, and I wanted to do it as close to release as possible. And then all of a sudden, it now seems like we might have all the time in the world because things are seem to be dying down in Iran, but maybe they're not. I hope not. And probably dying down is the wrong use of words. I don't mean it that way. And anyway, for those of you who know, Ken Pollack, my former colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, now the vice president for policy at the Middle East Institute. Besides from MEI and AEI, there are other three-letter organizations he has worked for in the past. You can do your own due diligence on that. He knows a great deal about the Middle East and Iran in particular, and he's a friend of the pod and a fan of the pod, and there's no one I would rather talk to about all this than you. So, Ken, welcome back to the Remnant.
Thank you so much, Jonah. Always love being on the Remnant because I am such a devoted listener of the Remnant.
Well, we won't hold that against you in terms of your expertise, but all right. So where to begin on this? Actually, that's my question. Where to begin on this?
Sure. So we can certainly talk a little bit about what's going on in Iran today. The regime seems to have quelled the protests, right? Bloodily, right? Let's recognize that. We don't know the numbers of people killed, but it's certainly in the thousands. We have Iranian officials admitting to at least 5,000 dead. And there are folks who believe it's 2 or 3 times that number. And, typically when a regime official says, yeah, we killed 5,000 people, in this kind of a nasty authoritarian regime, yeah, you can pretty much apply a factor of 2 or 3 to that. And that's meaningful because in the past, and this is also an important point that we should note, Iran has seen major internal protests. I date them to 1999, right? Different people start at different places. From my perspective, the first big internal unrest against the clerical regime was back in 1999 when students at Tehran University revolted, trying to get a national revolution going again. And periodically since then, every 2, 3, 4 years, there is another one of these major movements, right? And I think many of your listeners certainly will know about the 2009 Green Movement. They probably know about the revolts that took place in 2017, 2019, 2022, the Women Life Freedom Movement, right? So periodically, pretty much every 2 or 3 years since 1999, we've seen these kinds of revolts. It's rare that we see this much killing. The Iranian regime in the past had gotten very, very good at suppressing these revolts with lots of violence, but not death, not killing. The fact that they killed so many people is in and of itself interesting, right? And it can point in a couple of different directions. We can certainly talk about those. But these are, this was notably different from beforehand. What was the same is that the Iranian people want to be rid of this government, right? So let's understand, it did start with economic protests. You had a bunch of folks, Iranian Bazaar, that's a metaphor, not a specific place. We're rising up against the inflation, devaluation of the informal devaluation of the currency, the impact that this was having. Brought in all kinds of people from all walks of life. This is very normal for Iran these days. That's what these revolts all look like. They get started by one thing, but they immediately turn into massive protests against the government. The people want the government gone, right? That is consistent. And again, that too tells us something, that this is a country that is deeply unhappy with its leadership. Now, there's always a segment of Iranian society that will back the regime. Unfortunately, that's who the regime draws its internal security forces from. Right? Those are the ones who go out into the streets, beat people up, and this time around, they kill people. But from my perspective, Jonah, the other thing we really need to talk about today is the next time. because again, the history suggests there is going to be a next time, and could be very quick. This may not be completely over, maybe in 1, 2, 3 years, but there will be a next time. And from my perspective, one of the worst things that the United States has done in terms of its policy toward Iran over the last 20 or so years is to become, I wrote this in one of my books on Iran, serial amnesiacs, right? That every time one of these things happen, in the moment, we get all exercised about it. We start talking about what we might be able to do, and then the regime suppresses it, and we forget about it, right? And we just go right back about our business as if it's never going to happen again, as if we'll never be confronted with these choices once again, as if we will not ever have wished that we had done something different after the last one to set us up to make different decisions about the next one. And so, from my perspective, I actually think this is a great moment to be talking with you on The Remnant about this subject, because that's what we ought to be thinking about now is, okay, maybe we missed this opportunity. And again, maybe we didn't. Maybe it'll start up again. There are reasons to think that maybe it hasn't died down completely. But even if it has, now is the moment when we ought to be thinking about, okay, what should we be doing differently so that in 1, 2, 3 years, when we've got another one of these revolts, we've got different choices to make.
Okay, I want to get to all that. Some other cleanup work on the low-hanging fruit questions. The besieged, first of all, is that how I say it? Right?
Besieged, yeah.
Okay, so there's sort of the street goon, fascisti militia types, right? Not quite uniformed, not IRGC, that kind of thing. But when you talk about elements of, there will always be elements of society that support the regime. In some places, those are ethnic subculture, right? Like ethnic minorities that feel like they're going to get killed if the regime is gone, right? So like they're sort of, I don't know, the Druze in,
Right.
That kind of thing. And sometimes they're the super ideologues, like the SS, right, or the brown shirt types. Is any of that going on? I mean, because I think a lot of people don't know that Iran is a much more ethnically diverse country than you would think, because we just talk about the Iranians when in fact they're Kurds and Baluchs and all these other kind of things. Is there that kind of, Game of Thrones, internal Game of Thrones kind of stuff going on?
Sure, but in many ways, the opposite way, right? So you're
Uh-huh.
absolutely right. That's the kind of thing that often does go on. So, for instance, the Assads in Syria, they mostly drew from their own Alawite community and then a
Right.
number of other minorities. And yeah, because they could make the case that, hey, look, if we don't hang together, the Sunni majority are going to kill us all, right? In Iran, it's actually kind of the opposite. So you're right. There are huge numbers of minorities. Only 54% of Iranians are ethnic Persians, right? And there are all kinds of other groups. And by the way, we should talk about those other groups because most of them hate the regime. So
Yeah.
Kurds, Baluch, Arabs, Azeris, Gilzais, you name it. There's all kinds of different groups out
17
there.
Jews. Don't forget the 17 Jews.
Are we down to 17? Oh boy,
It's some crazy low number.
yeah,
It's very sad. Yeah.
right. I know when I was in the White House, we were down in the hundreds
Yeah.
because they, of course, were being persecuted. So we knew about it. But in Iran, as best we can tell, and again, it is hard because it's not like the regime publishes, sociological data on its society. But as best we can tell, it's mostly poor ethnic Persians who
Hmm.
are the regime's best supporters, right? So they're deeply religious. They typically are from rural society, rural communities. They're not terribly sophisticated, so they'll often believe what the regime tells them. And the regime has mostly made it out that, yes, minority groups and the upper classes, right? These jaded, West toxicated Iranian sons and daughters of the middle and upper classes, these are the ones who are revolting, right? And they're revolting because they want Iran to become vassals of the United States, right? And so they bring these people in and bring them into, things like the Basij and Ansar Hezbollah and these other groups that will back the regime. I mean, in this way, and I'm not a sinologist, but it's my understanding that's what kind of happened in Tiananmen Square,
Yeah.
was that the Chinese regime brought in military units composed of guys from the outside who had the same perspective on the protesters. So that seems to have been the model that the Iranians followed, I think very deliberately for that reason.
And so let's, when I said, get me Ken Pollack, barked it out to my staff and they immediately clicked their heels and ran. It's really interesting. So like I was doing, a little due diligence, listening to some Iran podcasts that are like 4 or 5 days old now, right? So like I was listening to the Ken Dubowitz one from FDD, and he had Rule on, and anyway, very optimistic sounding about that Trump was going to do something. Trump had tweeted, take their institutions, help is on the way. 4 days later, it really does feel like you could feel. I don't want to say it's a full on taco. Trump always chickens out, because that's actually not true. But sacco is a hard thing to say, which is Trump sometimes chickens out.
Mostly chickens out.
Yeah, that might work. The but the simple fact is that like the second he said the regime told me they postponed these hangings, and that's great, you could tell he was taking an exit ramp, and it may have been an exit ramp because he had no assets in the region because we're in the middle of doing this other thing in Venezuela. It may be that JD Vance got in his ear and said we don't want to do this, but it does feel like an opportunity was lost. How do you do the criminology necessarily, or the how do you think about the last 5 days and how it's worked out? Did we lose a major opportunity, a possible major opportunity, a definite minor? How do you factor it?
Sure. So I do suspect that we lost an opportunity, right? That's certainly my feeling about this. And um, we should definitely also talk about the military options that the U.S. has, how to think about them. But let's put that, off for just a minute. In terms of the opportunity that existed there, um, you know, what's striking to me about this is that it's coming, of course, roughly 6 months after the June Israeli-American airstrikes against Iran. And I don't think that that's coincidental. I find it very, very hard to believe that that's coincidental. First, I do think that that was part of the willingness of the Iranian people to rise up against the government. There was a strong sense all across Iran. You saw it everywhere. You heard it from people. You saw it in opposition press. There was a tremendous amount of criticism against the regime for that war, both in terms of provoking it and not being able to defend itself. There was a tremendous sense that the regime was weak. Right? It's one of the things that unsuccessful wars do. It's always worth remembering, just as a general point. We have a tendency to think that dictatorships go to war willy-nilly, and sometimes they do for a variety of different reasons. But some of them, smart ones, recognize that losing a war is incredibly dangerous to a dictatorship. Typically, you lose a war, you get overthrown. And
that's the story of Russia pretty much for the last 150 years, give or take, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, all throughout history, I'd say all throughout Middle East history, you can find you lose a war, you get overthrown. In fact, the crazy thing about the Middle East is there were many dictators who were overthrown who didn't even participate in the war, right? So, the Iraqi monarchy is overthrown in 1958 for not having participated in the 1956 Sinai-Suez War. Lots of examples like that. Anyway, but so this was a moment the regime was shown to be weak. The people saw it as weak. That created both opportunity and also added to their sense of grievance against the regime, that, you'd spent all this money building these capabilities. You couldn't even defend yourselves against the Americans, right? And so all of this certainly did play a role in causing the people to rise up against them. I also suspect, and I can't prove it, certainly not right now, But I suspect that that may have also been the reason for the regime's bloody response, that the regime was feeling embattled and frightened after the 12-day war, after the June American-Israeli airstrikes. They too probably believed that the people saw them as weak. They too probably were frightened about their internal cohesiveness. This may have been a massive overreaction. It may have been that in the absence of that war, you may have still had the revolt, but the regime would have felt much more confident in itself and just
Hmm.
used its old traditional non-lethal violent means to suppress it. Right. So this was a big deal, and I think again, I think the airstrikes in June had some role to play. I can't say specifically how much, but there's just too much out there indicating that they played a very heavy role, which suggests that had the United States been more active, right? And again, we can talk about what that means, but had the United States intervened more directly in different ways, that might have tipped things, right? That you might have caused another regime overreaction, that might have given much more heart to the protesters. And that first point that I made about the regime overreaction, that is an important one, because you often see that one of the biggest mistakes that a regime can make is in overreacting. And in
Hmm.
particular, if they became distracted by us and started fighting us in a whole variety of ways, that might have opened the door, enabled the protesters to do other things. Again, this is all speculation, but we should recognize revolutions are very rare events. Successful revolutions, I should say. Revolutions are commonplace, but successful ones are very rare. And the truth is, we don't know why one revolution succeeds and another one fails. Literally, the only thing that we really know, Theda Skocpol, very famous Harvard
Hmm.
sociologist, Theda Skocpol said the one true thing that we know about revolutions, which is that revolutions only succeed when the regime loses either the capacity or the will to use force, right? So
Hmm.
1917, the Russian Revolution, the regime loses the capability because of World War I, the Red Army falls apart, right? 1979, the Iranian Revolution, the Shah loses the will to use force, right? And if you kind of go back through history, that's the one common thing that we know out there. So if you want the next Iranian Revolution to succeed, you got to find ways to either eliminate its capability or its will. American intervention, more direct intervention, could get at both, right? As you were saying beforehand, it could cause a whole bunch of people to say, hey, I don't want to be part of this if the Americans are coming in on the side of the protesters, whatever they may think that means, right? Now, let's remember again, these are unsophisticated people, don't understand the United States, often exaggerate what we can or will do, right? But it also can speak to the capabilities of the regime. There's some military options, some other options that we have that could hinder the ability of the regime to repress its people, right? And again, given how unpredictable revolutions are, that's kind of what you're playing for, right? And if you're willing to do this, you got to try to just shift the odds a little bit and hope that the odds turn out in your way, in your favor.
Yeah, so it's funny. The analogy I always think of, um, with the study of revolutions, which I've done a bit of reading in, is there's uh, this clear but false idea that somehow the more you repress a people, the more you are buying a revolution. And it's the one of the metaphor the analogy I often think of is to prison riots. I remember John DiIulio, and if I'm butchering his explanation, I apologize. But 30 years ago, he was explaining. I used to have him on this TV show I used to produce, and he was explaining to me like his first major controversy as an academic was completely overturning or trying to overturn the conventional wisdom among penologists about why prison riots happen. And the metaphor that they always used was of the the lid being too tight on boiling water, and that if eventually if the lid is so tight it'll explode, right? And like this is the way they thought about it. And Julia was like, let's just look at the history of prison riots. It's all of these kind of medium security places where you have lots of people milling around, capable of coordinating action, spreading rumors, talking, able to organize because they're out on the tiers, they're walking around, they're in the yard. It's their freedom that makes the riot possible. The supermax prisons where everybody is individualized and atomized and like gets 30 minutes in the yard a day, they can't have a riot. Like they can't get out of their cells. And so he's like, his point was like, no, the clamped lid thing is true. It's false. It's like the clamped lid works. And if you look at North Korea is not going to have a revolution anytime soon. At least we can't tell, but like it's country. That's why the Shah went. That's why Gorbachev went over. It's these places, the most dangerous. It's like riding a tiger, right? The most dangerous time about riding a tiger is trying to get off the tiger. And authoritarian, that's that transition that creates the opportunity for revolution. And so people get the causality backwards. I think one of the things that's gotten good press, but not enough press, is the role of this inflation with the bazaris. Like people forget, but for the inflation of the Weimar Republic, you don't get the Nazi regime. And it can work in reverse too. If you have something closer to the Nazi regime existing, runaway inflation can get people, because people just really hate inflation, particularly middle classes. And that sort of gives me some hope, because I don't think the mullahs know how to like fix the inflation problem anytime soon. And so you could see the base truth that sort of drove this revolt hasn't gone away, right? It's not just that the repression hasn't gone away. It's that the quality of life is just getting more miserable.
Right. Yeah. So a couple of reactions. First, on your first point, which I completely agree with. Please understand that I was not trying to make the opposite point when I was talking about.
No, I know. Yeah.
Yeah. It's about the regime making mistakes. And can we get the regime to make mistakes?
Right.
Because that's where revolutions can succeed. No, I completely agree. Repression works, unfortunately. That's why there was no real revolt against Stalin. That's why Saddam was able to survive in power. The more repression you get, the worse it is. On your point about the economics, so this is also really important. And, I'm reminded of, 15 years ago, we had the Arab Spring, right? These revolts all across the region. And, you had a lot of people saying, well, this can't possibly be about economics. Because all the people revolting are sons of the and daughters of the middle class and upper classes, which of course is always the case, right? The revolutionaries themselves are always disaffected intellectuals who hate their own classes, right? But the people who do the revolting, right, when it becomes serious, are the lower classes, and it typically does start with economics for them. Now it gets translated into politics, right, and that's the kind of where things got muddy back in 2011. But yeah, there's no question here. It is the economic incompetence of this regime. And again, this is something important to think about. We talk about our sanctions, and our sanctions are part of the problem for the Iranians. Our sanctions are worsening their economic situation. But, and we saw this when Obama signed the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, right? In 2015, Obama signs the Iran nuclear deal with the Iranians. We lift many of the sanctions on the Iranians, and the Iranian economy improves, but not that much. And the reason it doesn't improve that much is because the most important causes of their economic distress are their own incompetent management of their economy and their complete corruption, right? And let's remember, this is a regime which, when it came to power in 1979, put clerics in charge of their economy. Clerics who didn't know the first thing about economics and, frankly, didn't care in almost every case, right? And then you added to that this horrendous corruption. And, have they gotten some better people? Yeah, there are some better people in the Iranian regime. But at the end of the day, it's still a regime run by clerics and now the Revolutionary Guards, who are ideologically infused thugs, basically. I mean, some of them are, some version of soldiers, also not terribly familiar with economics, and themselves deeply, deeply corrupt. So, yeah, it does not seem at all likely that this regime is going to reform itself. And in fact, whenever the regime talks about change, the changes it talks about making tend to be incredibly cosmetic, right? Because at the end of the day, the regime relies on the corruption to maintain its own base of support. And, that base of support is narrowing because the corruption is getting worse and worse and worse. And at points it gets so bad that they'll throw people in prison. My friend Siamak Namazi, the longest serving prisoner, or at least the longest serving foreign prisoner in Evin prison, was in prison for 8 years. Siamak was in this cell block in Evin prison where constantly you'd get former regime officials who would be thrown out for one reason or another and thrown into Evin prison. And he got to sit and talk with all of them. Fascinating set of experiences there. But it just speaks to how, even for this regime, people can get so corrupt that it becomes an embarrassment, or they cross the wrong people, right? They're corrupt, they take a deal away from somebody else, they wind up in prison. So you've got to the corruption is narrowing the base of support, but it's still critical to their base of support.
And doesn't, just one more thing for level setting, doesn't the IRGC basically own double-digit percentages of the economy? I mean, like they straight up own malls and shopping centers and businesses and all of that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And, a huge amount of the black market, which is an important critical component of the Iranian economy. I mean, again, nobody really knows, Jonah, that the number that's often thrown around is that the Guard owns about 30% of Iran's economy, which, it seems like a good number to me in the sense that it's a really, really big percentage of the economy.
Yeah. I mean, this goes to stuff I wrote about in my last book, which is that, what we call what we in the West call corruption is actually the way business was done for most of human history. Hey, my cousin's got I want to give my cousin the business, that kind of stuff. And it's amazing when you talk to people who tried to do the economic development stuff in Afghanistan, and they would talk to people and say, well, you have to put this contract out for a bid, and they're like, are you crazy? I can't give it to that clan, that kind of thing. And so it kind of, at some point you get to the point where you're talking about the black market as distinct from the economy is kind of silly. And certainly that was the case in Afghanistan. I think it's probably to some extent the case in Iran. All right. So let's get to what to do so your point that you wanted to get to was that there's going to be another one of these moments and we should be prepared to do something and have a plan off the shelf. I'd be curious whether you think the CIA or some other one of these agencies has a plan ready to go, right? Like one of the key ways bureaucrats, and this stuff far better than I, can impose themselves on foreign policy is by just not having the contingency ready. It's like, when the president says, I want options, I said, well, we don't have any options to develop. It's going to take us, 3 weeks to develop options. That's their own kind of quiet, slow walking veto on things. But let's say that certainly wasn't the case when such as an august person as yourself was at the CIA. So let's say you're back there and you can go back just 10 days in time, right? Or pick the time last week where it really seemed, oh crap, this thing really does seem to be at an inflection point. It could go over. What would you have done?
All right, so I'll answer that, but what I'd really like to talk to you in a little bit, Jonah, is let's also talk about the long-term stuff that needs to be put in place, because you're absolutely right. Off the cuff, it's very, very hard to do this stuff. Okay, and off the cuff, what could we have done? We might very well have been able to jam. And look, I have to be careful about this stuff. It's not just that some of it's classified; it's more that just I'm 25 years removed from the classified data in many cases. So, I don't know what our actual capabilities are, but, I certainly hear a lot of things, as do you as well. I read a lot of things. We may have been able to jam Iranian government communications to a much greater extent. We may have, they prevented their populace from using the internet. We may have been able to do more to enable their populace. I know that we were certainly seem to be trying. We may have been able to hinder their ability to use the internet, right? And, let's go beyond that to say that there may have also been cyber weapons that we may have had. Again, no one knows this. And with cyber weapons, it's important to caveat that by saying that literally no one knows what two sides our cyber capabilities are until you start to use them. Because the
Hmm.
whole point of cyber weapons is that if the other side knows that you have the capability, they
They protect
shut it
against it.
down, exactly,
Yeah.
and you lose the capability, right? So it's not like military forces, right? I can look at the Iranian Navy and say, they've got this many corvettes, this many frigates, this many small boats. It gives them this kind of a capability, which they could use in these different scenarios. You can't say that with cyber weapons, right? All we can say about cyber weapons is that we believe we're ahead of them, but they have made a lot of progress since Stuxnet, for example,
Hmm.
last 10, 15 years. But we just don't know. But nonetheless, we may have been able to mount cyber attacks on them, which would have further hindered their ability to act, may have sown more confusion in their ranks. But of course, the biggest thing that we could have done in the short term are the military options, right? And if you don't mind, can we take a couple of minutes to talk through
Yeah,
some of the
absolutely.
military options? Good.
Sure.
Okay, so when you're thinking about military options in this kind of a scenario, I think it's useful to think about two different kinds of military options that are designed to produce two different goals, right? So one is military options that might actually hinder the Iranian regime from using force and might enable the Iranian protesters to do more against the regime, right? So actually getting involved in these protests, in these riots, in these battles where you've got regime security forces killing protesters, right? They're things that the United States could have done. Right? We could have attacked Iranian command and control facilities, headquarters. Right? We could have attacked garrisons and vehicle parks, arms caches. Right? Literally gone after the infrastructure of the regime security forces. With the right kind of forces, we might have even been able to participate in the battles themselves. Right? If you've got air power constantly over target, could be in the form of loitering drones. You might have been able to go after IRGC, that is Revolutionary Guard vehicles, or even help personnel. Now, this requires an enormous amount of air power,
Hmm.
right? Manned, unmanned, whatever it may be, you've got to have a lot of air power, right? And let's understand, you need that air power over places like Tehran, right? And Tehran is hundreds of kilometers from any American air base that you could actually use, right? And let's also remember you would need the permission of the host country to use that air base, right? I think that was one of the biggest problems that Trump had in thinking about this was we have air power in the region, but it's in places like Kuwait and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates that seemed very, very reticent about our
Hmm.
participating in this and weren't going to allow us to fly aircraft from those places. And this is one of the, Newport News Shipyard, which builds our super carriers, used to have a fantastic, back in the days when we had magazines. Do we still have magazines, Jonah? I'm not even
they're
aware.
they're around. Usually
Are they?
special editions on Lady Di or
Okay.
something like that. But
Whatever
yeah.
it is, I guess, in the supermarkets I have seen some. But back in the day when we had magazines, Newport News had this phenomenal ad, full page ad they would do, Nimitz class aircraft carrier. And it was, the caption was 3.5 acres of American sovereignty over 70% of the globe, right? So in other words, you could park an aircraft carrier anywhere in the world's waterways, 70% of the globe, and it was 3.5 acres of American sovereignty where the
Right.
US could do whatever it wanted without having to ask permission of another country to do it, right? And we've seen this in the Middle East where we want to do some things and the host country's like, yeah, we don't want you to do that. We're not going to let you fly. And again, one of the things that sets us apart from from the animals, I guess, is that we actually will abide by that. When a
Hmm.
country tells us you're not going to fly from our airspace, you can't do it. So this kind of an intervention, right, is very difficult. We probably could have done some of it because we certainly could have flown aircraft from the continental United States. Even then, depending on where the missiles go, you're kind of overflying their country's airspace. We may or may not be willing to do that, but we'd probably want to have the permission. But that kind of intervention would be extraordinarily difficult, especially without the ability to either have a carrier in the Gulf, multiple carriers ideally, or the permission of the host governments. And even then, you know, having this kind of a real-time impact, we could bomb all these different sites. That would certainly have some impact on their ability to do things, but it's not great. Okay, so there's that set. The other set are, I'm going to use the term symbolic military actions that the United States could take, but symbolic's a really bad word because it suggests that it's not really meaningful, right? And I actually think these things could be meaningful, which would be simply a matter of striking at targets that were either connected to the regime or connected to Iranian military capabilities, but simply demonstrating that the United States is unhappy with the regime and that we're trying to put pressure on the regime, whether it's pressure to back off or simply saying to the Iranian security forces, we're here, we're not going anywhere, we're involved in this, we're trying to protect the Iranian people as best we can. You know, the United States starts blowing up things in a country, the country tends to take notice. Again, you and I are old enough to remember the 1990s when people used to complain about how we were doing nothing but pinprick cruise missile strikes against Saddam Hussein. And, I'll be the first one to say that there were moments when we could have done more to Saddam, when I wish we had done more to Saddam. But it wasn't correct to suggest that Saddam didn't care about those attacks. When a country is being bombed with impunity by a superpower, that is not a good look for the country.
Yeah.
Right? That is very painful. That is absolutely humiliating. And so it's, saying something is symbolic is not to suggest that it is meaningless. So, the Iranians have a little navy. They've spent a lot of money on it. That navy is very sinkable. Right? They've got an Air Force. The Air Force is old. You could blow up the Air Force. Right? They got all kinds of other things. And, so I'm picking purely military targets, which nonetheless would be humiliating for the regime to lose and would again be sending a signal to the protesters, we're with you, we are looking for ways to help. We could even communicate to them, hey, the issue right now is that we don't have the forces in place to provide more meaningful assistance. We're doing what we can, and as Trump said, help is on the way. As we bring more forces available, we will do more to help you. And again, in many cases, Jonah, it may simply be the psychological messaging which has the impact, right? It may be that, the regime is looking at it and seeing the U.S. is blowing up what we can. We blew up Revolutionary Guard headquarters in Tehran. We blew up Revolutionary Guard headquarters in Esfahan and other major cities. We're blowing up garrisons here and there. We're sinking the Navy, right? That's going to look really frightening to the regime.
You don't know what's next when that starts happening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So again, there are definitely things that the United States could have done that were kinetic. And I think these were the options that were being briefed to President Trump. We should also, of course, remember that chances are the Iranians are going to respond, right? And my sense is that it was the combination of Trump was told this is the likelihood this brings down the regime is probably less than 50-50, might be quite low depending on who is making the argument to him. And there's a high likelihood of an Iranian response, right? And so the other piece of we didn't have the forces in the region was not just that we didn't have the forces in the region to do that real support to the populace. It was also that, seems to be the case, the president was very frightened by what the Iranian response was going to be and our inability to defend against it.
Right. We could do A with limited resources, but then their response to A requires a lot more resources that we just couldn't have in a timely fashion in the region. That makes a lot of sense to me. So my friend, and maybe this is a segue into the long-term stuff that you wanted to talk about, but my friend Eli Lake, I recently heard him go on quite a tear about how, some of it was, let me put it this way. Given the way Trump has alienated various allies, some of this would be, it'd be awesome if my grandmother was a bus, right? Because it's, but nonetheless, I think he is right about some of this stuff, or at least I thought it was very interesting. One of the points, getting back to our earlier point about how revolutions are complicated things, and it's really, this is something Douglas North gets into in his history of order and violence and social orders. I can't remember the name of the book. Basically, it's about managing elites, right? If you can peel one, or the Theta Scotch one, right? If if the elites that are essential for regime violence switch sides or stay in their barracks or say, yeah, I'm going to sit this one out, that's when you have, when there are competing power centers, that's where you have these moments of conceivable regime changes, because the regime is fractured, the center doesn't hold, and all that. And so one of the points that he was making was there are an enormous number of Iranians living in the West who are the sons and daughters and brothers and uncles of members of the regime in Iran. They send their kids to our schools, or they send their kids to school in Paris or in Canada or wherever. And it would be ugly and a hardball, but saying to them, hey, look, you're going to live with your family. The question is, are you going to live with your family in Canada, or are you going to live with your family in Tehran? And, your kids have a pretty nice life, doing normal Western things in Toronto. Why don't you go live with them, play with your grandkids, rather than have your daughter and your grandkids all move to Tehran in a place where they don't want to live and they may not be safe. And you could put those kinds of pressures on to peel away elite regime elements, and then you could have a cascade effect, right? I mean, it's like the second you see, it's like in Congress, like what they call prison break, where you just get all of a sudden this cascade of people saying, well, I'm going to vote against the party on this, until the point where it becomes unsustainable not to vote for the thing. If you see 1, 2, 3, a steady bunch of people fleeing the regime, that creates real panic in where you want the panic. You want elite panic, not panic on the street, right? Are there things like that that we could be pursuing long term, or that we could have done in the immediate period last week, or God willing next week if things flare up again?
So probably yes, and Eli's suggestion is a perfectly good one. Although I don't want to suggest that Eli believes that this will bring down the regime.
No, he was like as a package of a lot of things.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly. So yeah, there certainly are. But I want to make a slightly different point, Jonah. But it's related to this, which is if we're going to be serious about bringing down this regime, we're going to have to be willing to run more risks than we have been. Right. It seems like part of our constant unwillingness to be helpful to the Iranians whenever they revolt, periodically as they do, is this fear of what the Iranian response is going to be. Right. And point one. We've seen Iranian responses over the past couple of years. They attacked Israel twice. They attacked our air base in Qatar once, and they've been kind of unspectacular. Right? You can say, well, they killed a lot of Israelis. Yeah, they killed 28 Israelis. By Israeli standards, that's a lot of people, right? By anyone else's standards, that's nothing, especially compared to what the Israelis did, right? And if we're going to allow, the death of any American to constitute mission failure, right? If that's too high a price to pay, then we shouldn't be in this game at all, right? And if we're going to be serious about taking down this regime, we've got to be willing to run some greater risks than we have been. Now, this brings me to point number 2, which is, from my perspective, I don't think that we take the Iranian threat seriously. Right? I think we need to recognize that the Iranian regime is our enemy. Right? I'm going to use that word enemy, right, in a way that I actually think is to a much greater extent than either Russia or China is, maybe the North Koreans. I don't think the Russians and Chinese mean us well, but they are not working feverishly to hurt us. They have not been killing Americans on a systematic basis over the last 30 years the way that the Iranians have. And again, this is not out of any bloody-mindedness on my part or looking for enemies. As you know well, when I was in government, I was, one of the big proponents of trying to reach out to the Iranians. And I always make the point, I've made it on the remnant before, that every single American president since Jimmy Carter has tried for a reconciliation with the Iranians, right? And some have gone to extraordinary lengths. Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, right? The Iranians will never get an American president as pro-Iranian as Barack Obama, and they scorned him too. They are not interested, right? And they're not interested because they want us as their enemy, right? Again, we've had any number of Iranian leaders, including Khamenei, say that he wants us as leader as his enemy because it's the only thing he has left of Khomeini's legacy from the Iranian Revolution, right? In addition, everything that we know from people who get to speak to Khamenei is that he believes all of these crazy conspiracy theories. He believes that we're responsible for all the problems in his country, in part because he doesn't want to acknowledge all the
Right.
problems that he created. So they are our enemy, and they are working tirelessly to hurt us and have been. Right? They killed 600 or more Americans in Iraq. They killed almost 300 Americans in Lebanon. They killed 19 Americans in Saudi Arabia. Where they can hurt us, they do so. Right? And let's remember, Lebanon, Iraq, right? It's not like what we were doing was directed at them. Right? These were, in fact, in particular in Lebanon, right? They had no dog in that fight until they decided to pick one, until they decided to jump in and start killing Americans. And in Iraq, a big part of it was a wonderful opportunity to kill Americans. Right? They are a force for evil in the Middle East, in the world. They are certainly a force of anti-Americanism. Right? And I don't think that we take that threat seriously. And in fact, one of my problems with President Trump's approach to Iran is this whole make Iran great again. Right? This is nonsense, right? He seems to think that Iran is just another garden variety country looking for a better deal, right? They're not. They define us as their enemy. They do everything that they can to hurt us. And so in my mind, that should justify being willing to take more risks and even incur more costs to deal with these people because they are real problems. Let me add another point to that, which is one of the reasons, I think the most important reason that our allies in the Middle East aren't supportive of our efforts to foster regime change in Iran right now is because the Iranians are so weak, right? The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, even the Israelis look at Iran and right now say, they are so weak. They're not a threat to us now, which is pretty much a true statement. The problem is that if you allow them to recover, they will be. Right? They will be again. We've seen this movie before.
Yeah,
The
can I ask
Iranians
you
come back.
a
Yeah.
question about that? Like, I've seen this point made by other people about how Bibi is a voice of restraint in all of this, and that the Israelis are reluctant. And I get it. Israelis are pretty war fatigued, and they have good reason to say, "Hey, we need to take a breather too." But if there's a country anywhere in the world that understands the point you were making before, or just prior, Iran is Israel's enemy, right? And I agree with you entirely that Iran is our enemy. I remember Tom Nichols and I talking about this. Like, one of the revelations about the Soviet Union when all the archives were cleared and all that was, hey, it turns out they really were communists. Like, there was no double bookkeeping where, like, in the Politburo, once they closed the door, they said, okay, so what are we going to do about commodity prices and floating our currency on the internet? Like, they were just straight up communists. The mullahs are straight up fanatics and hate America as a theological principle. They also hate Israel as a theological principle. Given how there's all of this stuff, which I think is largely true, you can correct me if you think it's overblown, but like, the Iranian people themselves tend not to be all that anti-Israel. Iran was pretty friendly with Israel in the time of the Shah, selling it oil when no one else would, all that kind of stuff. When you say, oh, it's too weak to go out to do something about them right now, so, well, when they're weak, seems like the perfect opportunity to do something. What is the Israeli I get Trump's calculation is like, he's got his eyes on Venezuela and the affordability, and he's got a vice president who swore we weren't going to be doing any more Middle East regime change stuff. So he's got his own set of issues. I get, in a weird way, I understand Trump better than I do Israel in this circumstance. What is the calculation for Israel to say, oh my gosh, we have this opportunity to actually do regime change? Why are they slow in their roll?
Sure. So, look, first point, John, nobody really knows, right? There's lots of rumors, lots of conjecture. But as I understand the Israeli position, it's more nuanced than that. We don't yet, I'll put it this way. First, when Bibi came to Washington in December, as best everyone understands, his main talking point was, I want to bomb Iran. Right? So it's not that the Israelis are shy about using force. It seems to be that the Israelis don't like the idea of using force in these circumstances because, one, they're not sure that it actually is going to help the protesters and hinder the regime, right? And that goes to my point about, how big an effort it would require to meaningfully help the protesters. Two, he is afraid that it will engender an Iranian response, which by the time January rolled around, the U.S. wasn't prepared to help Israel deal with because we had so many assets in the Caribbean, right? And
Okay.
weren't properly postured for it. In addition, again, what the Israelis seemed to want was they wanted to go after Iran's missile program,
Right.
right? Which, and again, I think Bibi had a bunch of complicated, both regional and internal political reasons for wanting to do that, not necessarily the regime change piece, which again, I think Israel would be fine with regime change in Iran. They'd welcome it. But if they don't think that it's likely and they think that they're going to get a big blowback for it, that becomes problematic,
Yeah.
right? And that's another really important piece that's worth mentioning. And I still do want to come back to your original question to me about what we can do in the long term. But before we do that, let's recognize, and I think this was part of President Trump's calculus. I hope it was. If it was very smart to be thinking about it in these terms, which is if you are going to start using military force against the Iranian regime at a moment of extremis, right, when they are feeling threatened by the revolt of their people, you're now putting the regime's survival in jeopardy, right? That's the whole point. That's the goal of this, is to place the regime's survival in jeopardy. The regime is likely to lose all restraint under those circumstances, right? We should never forget the fact that while the Iranian responses have been weak and much less effective than I think many people feared, nonetheless, they didn't use their full panoply of capabilities, right?
Right.
There are additional things that the Iranians probably could do, right? They could go after oil in the Persian Gulf. They could try to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. They may also have cyber weapons against the United States here, right? Not necessarily our bases. And under these circumstances, the regime would have no incentive to hold back on them, right? If they thought the United States was coming for the regime, they're going to use everything they've got to try to save themselves. And so you have to, if you're the president of the United States, you have to ask yourself the question, okay, well, if I do this, what's the likelihood that they start taking action against oil? Does this drive up the price by $5, by $10? Do they try to shut down the Strait of Hormuz? Does that drive up the price of oil by $50, right? These are considerations. And then, as I said, there's the cyber piece, and again, they might even have some drone capability, but the cyber piece is big. If they shut down the power grid of the city of Chicago, right, that would cause chaos, right? And as president of the United States, you have to ask yourself the question, do I want to take the risk that the Iranians have the ability to shut down the power grid of one of my cities or water sewage treatment, right? Something like that, where, you would have a horrific situation. And again, you could look at it and say, well, it's not going to be nearly as bad to us as it is for the Iranians. But the question is always, how do the American voters feel about it in the context of what they got? And are they going to say, what you did to Chicago doesn't justify the fact that you overthrow the regime? Again, different presidents may come at it in different ways, but these are going to be things that a president has to think about. So, while I say on the one hand, I think the United States needs to recognize that Iran is our enemy, and we need to be willing to do more about it and fight it as an enemy, I'm not suggesting that we should throw out all considerations of cost-benefit analysis, because while they are our enemy, it's not Nazi Germany in the 1930s, right? Their power is ultimately limited. It's dangerous. They do all kinds of bad things. They impose all kinds of costs on us, but they're not going to be able to take over the world, right? It's not that big a threat. Okay, if you don't mind, can I come back to your original question?
Yep, let's do it.
All right, so your original question was, what can we do longer term? And my answer was, first and foremost, that's why I started on this track, we should recognize that they're our enemy, right? And proceed accordingly, right? So all of this, make Iran great again, we just want to deal with you. I'm okay with making deals with enemies, right? That's what arms control is all about. But let's not fool ourselves that this is just a minor disagreement over nuclear, over uranium enrichment. And once we solve that problem, we can all have wonderful lives, right? If you deal with the nuclear piece, that's only one piece in a much bigger problem. right? So point number one is let's acknowledge that this is our enemy. Point number two, there is all kinds of things that we could do to make regime change more likely in Iran, to make it harder for the Iranian regime to rule. And I'll just go back to a point that you raised earlier, which from my perspective is the really important one, which is helping Iran's own internal fissures to come apart. Right? As you and I were both saying, you've got all kinds of groups. You've got Kurds who hate the regime. You've got Baluch who hate the regime. You've got Arabs who hate the regime. You've got very badly disaffected middle class, upper class young people who hate the regime, right? You've got people who are suffering because of the economic and ecological catastrophes created by this regime, right? Those are all people who we ought to be reaching out to on a regular basis to try to figure out how we help them cause mayhem for the regime, right? And this comes back to your question about covert action. The truth is, covert action typically takes a long time. Sure, if we get the intel, whether it's that Maduro was at this, this facility where he wasn't, terribly well guarded, or remember Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general in charge of the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guards, who Trump killed back in 2020. Again, we got intel that he was going to be at the Baghdad airport in the middle of the night, nobody else around. Yeah, you can act on that. But that's rare, and it's a kind of a one-shot deal. This would be a much bigger effort, right? And we should also remember, when the United States, and I'd argue other countries as well, but particularly when the United States has had success in bringing about coup attempts and revolutions, we were never the main actor, right? It's one of the great myths of the 1953 coup in Iran, is this notion that the United States made it happen, right? That but for Kermit Roosevelt and his band of merry men, Mossadegh would still be in power in Iran to this day, which of course is utter nonsense, right? Mossadegh had alienated pretty much every one of Iran's elite groupings. They all hated him. They were all looking to get rid of him. They were all trying to get rid of him by themselves, right? And then Kermit Roosevelt and CIA come along and they give a little bit of help. And I would say, again, even as a former CIA officer, I'd say our role was actually quite exaggerated in that. But this is the kind of thing that you'd want to be doing in Iran, is working with all these groups, making contact with them, seeing what is possible, creating the circumstances so that the next time there is a revolt, they are more willing to take risks for themselves and more able to fight against the government. And as you pointed out, there's a lot of stuff to work with in Iran. From my perspective, that is the most important thing that the U.S. could be doing. And let's also recognize you get two other real benefits from going down that approach. One, you're going to distract the regime, because the thing that the regime cares most about is their own control over the country. So the more that you're threatening that, the more that they're going to concentrate on their own internal affairs. Certainly true that they may choose to retaliate elsewhere. As I said, I'm willing to accept that, because I actually think that we're already in a war with the Iranians. It's just one we're choosing not to fight. Right. So point number one is you're going to distract them, get them to concentrate their resources primarily internally, because they will be paranoid about that. Right. And, second point is it also becomes, if you really want to go this route, it becomes wonderful leverage for negotiating. Now, again, I wouldn't make the deal that Trump is proposing, but if you want to have an arms control agreement over nuclear weapons, I've always felt that the greatest leverage you could get against this regime is threaten their internal control. Right? They will agree to all kinds of things if they think that you are threatening their internal control, things that they would never agree to for giving up anything else.
We should just address quickly, we've had several episodes where you've been on talking about will we, should we, can we go after the nuclear program. We went after the nuclear program. My understanding is that, I know Trump says it was totally obliterated, but if they're rebuilding it, we'll do something. But most everybody else I've heard from says we did real damage, but there's still a nuclear program and there's still something there to rebuild. What is your take? Like, if you were grading the success of that mission, in terms of 10 being truly took it out and it's gone, and we'll have to start from scratch, and 0 being, oh crap, the chandelier fell, but get a mop and a broom and fix it, and let's keep going because the nuclear program's just fine. Where would you put that operation?
All right, so it's a hard one to do that way. I think that the mission as a military mission, and here we're talking about both what the Israelis did and what
Mhm.
the United States did, was superb, right? We did
Yeah,
enormous damage, right? My sense is that we did, again, speaking collectively, we did as much damage as was possible to do, right? The strikes seem to have been quite brilliant. And again, nobody really knows because we actually can't see down into these places.
right.
But that seems to be the consensus view, and I have no reason to doubt it. So I think the military mission was highly, highly successful. But there are two buts, right? And that's why if you ask me to give a grade, Jonah,
Mhm.
the only grade I could give at this point is incomplete.
Yeah,
Okay. Great. Issue number one is we didn't get all the highly enriched uranium. We just don't know where it is. We only bombed one of the places where we knew it to be, right? So they've got the highly enriched uranium. Um, my conversations with people who know how to make nuclear weapons is it actually would not be terribly difficult for the Iranians using that to fashion those into crude bombs if they chose to do so. Now, I do also think there's an element of fear that the Iranians right now are very much minding their P, or at least they were before these revolts, minding their P's and Q's, trying not to give us or the Israelis an excuse to come and bomb them beforehand. But you never know what you don't know, and they may have some truly deep clandestine program where they're taking that HEU and fashioning it into nuclear weapons, right? That may well be going on. But so point number one is even in the immediate term, there was stuff that we always knew was out there. The HEU, a bunch of centrifuges that we knew that they had built, but weren't located in those plants, right? And a whole variety of other things. And again, we destroyed this metal manufacturing capability, but my understanding from the experts is it's actually easy to do this kind of stuff. You didn't really need that facility itself, right? So there's that set of problems of even within the existing nuclear program, there seems to be enough that they could rebuild if they chose to do so, right? And that's the longer term issue for me is at the end of the day, what matters is whether 3 years, 5 years from now, Iran has a nuclear weapon, right? You've heard me say this. Your listeners have heard me say this. I apologize, but I'm going to say it again. In 1981, the Israelis bombed the Iraqi nuclear program, which was located at a place called Tuwaitha, right? The reactor that they bombed was called the Osirak reactor. That's the name everybody knows. And at the time, everyone believed that the Israelis had done the world a great mitzvah, right? That they had eliminated Iraq's nuclear program. And what we found out both after the Persian Gulf War in 1991 and the invasion of Iraq in 2003, what we found out was that in point of fact, what the Israelis had done was to vastly accelerate the Iraqi program. That before 1981, it had been chaotic, kind of moribund. It wasn't Iraq's highest priority. Yes, Saddam wanted a nuclear weapon. Yes, he wanted it to do horrible things with, right? I mean, he talked about using it against Israel. He wanted it for offensive purposes, all the worst things. But the program itself wasn't his highest priority. He's fighting the Iran-Iraq war. That was his highest priority. But once the Israelis bombed it, he kicked it into overdrive and threw resources at it, and it started making far, far greater progress than it ever had been. And it used to be that we all kind of, in 1991, we would say, thank God for the Israelis, because they meant that we didn't have to face an Iraqi nuclear weapon when Saddam invaded Kuwait in 1990. What we learned after was the exact opposite. Thank God Saddam was such an idiot for invading Kuwait in 1990 and not waiting 2 or 3 years when he probably would have had a nuclear weapon because of how much it accelerated. That, for me, is the key issue with Iran. Have we actually ended this program? Are we never going to have to face an Iranian nuclear weapon? Or have we now convinced the Iranians that the only way to deter future American or Israeli attack is to have a nuclear weapon? And we know there are Iranians saying this. They're saying it publicly. Regime officials are saying this out loud, that we now have to get a nuclear weapon because it's the only way to deter the Americans and the Israelis from further attack. Right. So I don't know the answer to it. And what I'll say is I'd really prefer to never find out, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's another reason why I think bringing down this regime is the right thing for the United States. It's right for us strategically. It's right in every way I can imagine.
There are a couple other things people are going to yell at me for saying, how come you didn't ask about this, right? This is the way I live my life as a servant of my listeners.
And we thank you
Uh,
for it, Jonah.
First of all, I had no idea until this latest round that I've been pronouncing Pahlavi wrong. I like I always thought it was Pavlavi because that's sort of how it looks on the screen on the page. Um, I don't know if I ever told you this, but when I was in high school, the Shah's family the son of the Shah's personal physician was in my high school. And so like I don't need to spill any tea about him, but let's just say it was not a shocking backstory. And but so Pahlavi, right? That's the correct way. He's been the subject of a lot of ridicule, right, for a long time from people, sort of the Persian Dolphin kind of thing, and he's been living in the West, and I have no personal feelings about him one way or the other than that it's transparently obvious to me he'd be better than the status quo, particularly if he's true to his word that he just wants to be part of like a unifying symbol and do a democratic transition and yada yada yada. That would all be great. How much of the I now, whether it's the shooting in Minnesota or the street protest in Iran, I have big helpings of grains of salt whenever I see videos of things, because you never know who's, you never know, is this capturing a real moment or is this taking advantage of a real moment for propaganda? And I don't say propaganda necessarily in a negative term, right? Democratic activists use propaganda too. But it does seem, according to the Western press and a lot of these videos, a lot of people are holding up his picture and chanting his name and all of this. How much of that is organically about him, and how much of that is that the regime has been so good at eliminating other unifying symbols that he's sort of the last one, and it's a way of just simply showing defiance, right? I mean, it's like I'm not a huge Stormy Daniels fan, the porn star who slept with Donald Trump. But if I wave a sign of Stormy Daniels in front of Donald Trump and say, long live Stormy Daniels, it's pretty clear that what I'm really saying is F you to Trump, right? Is that, I don't think it's all it is, but is it more of something like that than it is a sort of, De Gaulle in exile and he's coming back kind of thing?
Yeah. So as always, have to be careful. We don't know, right? We don't get to take a poll of all of the Iranian protesters. I think it is a combination of the two. I do think that it is more the latter than it is the former. Right. On the former point, look, there are a lot of Iranians who have nostalgia for the days of the Shah. And let's also remember, most of the people who have nostalgia for the days of the Shah didn't live under the days of the Shah.
It's mostly those young women who want to wear short skirts and have nice handbags and have real lives, right? And go to school, like that kind of thing.
Right. Who wouldn't? Exactly. But at the end of the day, you've got a very young population, and they hate the current regime. They feel it's very oppressive, and they're told stories by their elders about what it was like in the day of the Shah, and it sounds fantastic, right? Look, the Shah's era was also very problematic, and there were all kinds of issues there as well. But people don't tell those stories. People have selective memory, and it's really bad now. So even then, even if you were being honest about then, it was better than it is now.
But is it fair, just on the Shah point, real quick? Is it fair to say, look, the Shah did some bad things. I don't dispute that in the slightest, and he wasn't his father. But that's sort of the point, right? Is he wasn't his father. His father, the current Pahlavi guy's grandfather, was a kick-ass and take names repressive guy, And to our earlier conversation about how repression works, part of the problem with the Shah in the 1970s was that he was pissing off a lot of elites with selling of land, big estates, and doing these land things to the peasants and all these kinds of things. And if he had been more repressive, he might have stayed in power, but he wasn't willing to mow down mobs of people. At least that's sort of the two cheers for the Shah version of events. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah.
Look again. We need to be straight with the. So the first Pahlavi, Reza Shah, who takes power in the 1920s. Yeah, he's an army officer. He's kick-ass. He puts the country together. By the way, also very progressive, right?
Yeah. Sort of like an Ataturk type, right?
Yes, entirely of that ilk, right? Yeah. And that's how he saw himself. Very, very progressive, was trying to do all kinds of progressive things that looked great to Americans, Westerners, etc. His son, Mohammad Reza Shah, the last Shah, yes, he lives in his father's shadow. He's the son of a great man. He's got all those issues. And yes, he doesn't want to kill people, which is why he winds up out of office, dying of cancer outside the country rather than retaining power. But to your earlier point, is that there is some element of life was better under the Shah, and certainly Iranians today who never lived through it see it as having been much better, infinitely better than it was today. And how much better, hard to say. But I think there's no question that your latter point is correct. I do have the sense that this is the bigger issue. It's that there simply is no one else, right? Everyone else has either been, killed, imprisoned, corrupted by the system. I mean, there are these reformist leaders out there. They're mostly under house arrest. They no longer have voices. Reza Pahlavi is outside the country, right? And he's able to speak, and he's able to, say what Iranians want to be said, as opposed to the reformists on the inside, who in some cases may believe the same thing, but they can't say it. Right, because they're under the control, the power of the government. And in other cases, again, they're people who they believe in some degree of reform, but they don't want to completely destroy the system. They're more like Gorbachev types who are hoping to reform it to save it. And most of the protesters, they're way beyond that. They're not in the reform it to save it, or just reform it to make it a little bit better. They're in the get rid of the whole thing. And that's kind of what Reza Pahlavi seems to represent to most of them. And by the way, that's notable. That's worthwhile. Even 3 years ago, during the Women Life Freedom protest movement, you didn't have that, right? They weren't rallying around him. There was kind of no one, right? You had this young woman, this martyr, Masa Amini. She was the one figure that she was just symbolic, but she wasn't an actual person. She couldn't lead. And as you pointed out, Reza Pahlavi is being smart in saying, I don't want to become the Shah again, but I want to help guide a transition to democracy. That sounds terrific. And I think it sounds terrific to a lot of Iranians.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like the Winnie the Pooh thing in China, right? It's because it's seen as defiant of the regime, it takes on a life of its own. And I think that Pahlavi wanting to be a responsible steward for his people, and it would redeem the family name if he could just help, right? And to your earlier stuff about the nuclear program, what I hear in your analysis of it about how these kinds of things can accelerate the quest, it just underscores the point that the way you actually long-term deal with the nuclear threat from Iran is regime change. And I will say, that doesn't necessarily mean that a more democratic, more westernized Iran doesn't eventually get a nuclear bomb. Because like the lesson of the last 30 years is if you get a nuclear bomb, you're not going to get attacked by these superpowers. And, but that would still lessen the threat of a nuclear, like no one stays awake at night thinking about the fact, oh crap, the Brits have nuclear weapons, right? Or the French have well, maybe some people, but the French, but it's the nature of the regime that makes it a threat in the same. I mean, I don't mean to sound too much like the NRA, but guns don't kill people, people kill people. And so, I don't worry very much about, privates in the U.S. Army having guns. It's people who shouldn't have guns having guns, and same thing with nuclear weapons. You're free to respond to that, but I do want to ask you, because one of the reasons why we're recording this on Martin Luther King Day, happy Martin Luther King Day, everybody, January 19th, first thing in the morning, and over the weekend, things went full wacky Japanese game show with Greenland. And just as a seasoned foreign policy professional, which I think we can call you, right? You have sat around many an ornate oak table over bottled water and clever cheese in European capitals. What the hell do you think about what we're doing here?
Sure. Actually, let me make one last point on Iran, and
Yes.
then we'll talk Greenland. So on Iran, I think you're getting at, another point that we should take into account when we talk about regime change in Iran. Again, I believe the United States should be pursuing a more aggressive policy of regime change in Iran. But, one of the things I love about the remnant, Jonah, is that, you are great about saying, hey, look, I think we need to do this. It's not without costs. It's not that this is going to be easy, but I nonetheless believe that we do this. That's my feeling about regime change in Iran. And, one of the last ones that we haven't talked about, I think most people are aware of it, so I won't dwell on it, is that we don't know what's going to happen in Iran. We're talking about transition to a nice, stable democratic government. That'd be great in Iran.
Right.
I'm not going to bet that that's the likely outcome. I mean, I
Right.
actually think that civil war is a very real alternative. That's what Iran had back in 1919, 1920. That's what Reza Shah put an end to. You could easily have, a very nasty dictatorship, maybe one that wasn't as anti-American, maybe one that didn't want a nuclear weapon, but that might be a really good alternative to what we have now, is just a nasty military dictatorship. So
Yeah.
again, we don't know what comes. And again, that has to be factored into this question. It's also, let's recognize no one is talking about an American invasion of Iran. I
Right.
certainly don't think that that's merited. But in the absence of that, our ability to control what happens there is going to be negligible, which again opens the door to some pretty bad scenarios. I will also end by saying, you were asking about other things the U.S. should be doing to prepare. One of the things that we should be doing is having a whole project to look at Iran after this regime, right? And what could be done, both in terms of organizing Iranians and in terms of organizing other international actors to say, hey, look, we've had periodic revolts against this regime. It could fall at any minute. We ought to be prepared for that, right? And what we're ready to do for it, which, by the way, I couldn't think of anything that would be more frightening to this regime, because it would look like a serious American effort at regime change that I think would terrify them. Okay, now on to Greenland. So I find this absolutely gobsmacking. Yes, I can recognize at some level that the raw materials, the resources of Greenland are important for the West to have access to. I'm much more confident in free markets to deliver those resources, right? Greenland is ultimately run by Denmark. The Danes have not imposed any, they've not engaged in a trade war with us until now, right? Until Donald Trump provoked one. So I see no reason in God's green earth why the prevailing system can't deliver all of Greenland's resources to us. And if we're concerned about the Chinese or the Russians buying this or that, we can certainly talk to the Danes and the Greenlanders about that. I think the notion that the Russians are going to invade Greenland or the Chinese are going to invade Greenland and take those resources is absurd, right? All we're doing is picking a fight with our NATO ally and driving the rest of our NATO allies insane and driving them into the opposition. We could very well break NATO over this, utterly meaningless. I will also say that, I really don't like this image of the United States at all. I think that it is very bad for the United States. We are bullying, we're bullying our own allies. We are behaving in a horribly immoral fashion, not just in terms of bullying our own allies, but let's recognize this is just naked imperialism, right?
Hmm.
This is naked colonialism. I seem to remember, I don't know if it was you or one of your guests, but months ago on The Remnant, someone making the point that you can kind of understand Donald Trump's perspective as being kind of a 17th century perspective on the world, right?
Right.
Divine right of kings, imperialism, mercantilism. Probably leaving one more out, but yes, this seems to be part of it. No one's talking about, Trump isn't saying, by God, there ought to be a plebiscite in Greenland, and the Greenlanders should decide whether they want to stay part of Denmark, or, if they're going to become part of the United States, are they going to become a state? Right? What are they? You call them a territory. Those are colonies in effect. We're not talking about freeing the Greenlanders from from Danish oppression. We're talking about taking their country for ourselves. I find that absolutely horrible. I know you've made the point about national honor, which I absolutely agree with. And I'll just take it to another point that one of the things that historians have remarked on is that that American hegemony. I'm not going to use the word empire because I think that the whole point is it's a misnomer, right?
Right.
We're the weirdest empire in the world if we are an empire. But American hegemony has actually produced the least resistance in human history because of how benign it is. Because at the end of the day, we are anti-imperial, and you can appeal to us. We don't always do the right thing, but we do the right thing far more often than other people. We've intervened in many countries around the world on humanitarian grounds. We try very hard to hold ourselves to a higher standard, right? And that has resulted in tremendous goodwill, which has meant far less opposition globally to American hegemony than, again, any other prior global or even regional hegemon has ever faced, right? And we are throwing that away in Greenland.
Yeah. There's this paper these academics will put in the show notes that I've been noodling a lot, arguing that I think they're from Georgetown, but I can't remember. That one possible way of thinking about the global order that we're entering is neo-royalism, and with basically a bunch of dynastic orders, Habsburg type things around the world that behave like empires, right? And this is one of the things that just drives me absolutely crazy about and you've heard me rant about this, but
I enjoy it, Jonah.
well, I mean, like, you're a think tank guy, I'm a think tank guy. We like arguing, and we think arguments really matter, both in actual policy formation, right? But also, democracy itself is about arguing. It's about disagreement. The people who say, "Oh, democracy is about unity," don't know what democracy is. Democracy is about peaceful disagreement, and um, so the thing that I think is so undemocratic about the way not just Trump, but the entire sort of MAGA movement and Trump movement do things is that it's not about arguments. It's all pretextual. Trump, God bless him, he actually signals these things from time to time. He said, and I think it was I can't remember who he was being interviewed by. Maybe it was the Times, but he just said, look, ownership psychologically is really important for me, and about Greenland. And because, we have this treaty from 1951 that says if you guys want to turn it into just one massive military base, you can, right? And it's not like the 30,000 Greenlanders are going to be like Qatar and refuse to let us use those bases in response to Russian or Chinese aggression. And it's sort of like the operation in Venezuela. Like, we were told, oh, this is all about drugs and fentanyl, right? And which is obviously a lie. And then the second he gets in there, he says, actually, no, I'm going to prove myself right by saying we should do this stuff to take oil. And I can't argue with these people because they're all in bad faith. And they grab like Scott Bessent. I don't know if you saw him on Meet the Press yesterday.
No.
But he was asked about these tariffs, because we're leveling tariffs on 8 countries and 8 European allies after having cut deals with this administration which just shows that you can never cut a deal with this administration that it'll keep if Trump, says, "Ooh, look, cows," whatever. And Besant was asked, so what's the emergency justification for these tariffs? Because these tariffs require an emergency. And his answer is the emergency here is to prevent an emergency, which is just the most ridiculous talking point, right? I mean, it's like the crisis that gives us the authority to use crisis powers is to prevent a crisis from happening, right? That cannot be a serious argument taken by the Supreme Court, or it shouldn't be by Congress, but here we are. And I just worry, how do you repair some of this stuff, particularly if the GOP, becomes a truly Trumpian party on foreign policy after Trump? We got real. I've managed to go this far into the Trump era without actually worrying about the future of democracy or the global liberal order or any of these kinds of things. I thought everything was more resilient. This BS is starting to make me pretty nervous.
Yeah. So, look, they just chip away, and at some point, are they going to break the ice altogether? And I've been saying to myself that hopefully, once he is gone from office, and hopefully that will be in January of 2029, that we will get a restoration president. Now, first, I don't think that we will get another Trump. Right? We may get somebody else from the Republican Party who would be, problematic in other ways, right? J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance is not Trump,
right?
But nevertheless, he also has a whole bunch of ideas that would be very, very problematic, say, for the NATO alliance. My hope is that we will either get a reasonable Republican candidate. I'm just picking one at random here, but maybe a Nikki Haley. Or we get a reasonable Democratic candidate, right? And they become restoration candidates, right? In effect, what Biden did at the beginning of his term, where he went around and basically, everyone, felt he was the greatest president since Lincoln, simply because he wasn't Donald Trump, right? And he was able to undo some of the damage. Now, first Trump is not second Trump, right? And obviously, Biden had their own issues there. We don't know what, even if we don't know we will get a restoration president. And if we do get a restoration president, not clear where we will be at that point in time, right? That to me is exactly what you're getting at is, how are our European allies going to respond to this? And will they end up taking steps that, can't be rolled back? Or, will they take steps that cause Trump to then say, to double down or triple down, as he's perfectly willing to do, right? He's got 3 more years in office. And given how much he's done in the first year, perhaps we will get to a point where even if we have a restoration, first, we may not get a restoration candidate because things have moved so far in the other direction. Or if we do, they're not able to undo it. So, I agree with you. And again, I just look at Greenberg as Greenland. Too many Jews. I look at the Greenland issue as just such an own goal, right? Such shooting ourselves in the foot, right? Why are we doing this? It's so unnecessary. And, as you pointed out, Jonah, it does seem to be, Trump's glory, right? And I think if you really want to understand Trump's foreign policy, to some extent, his domestic policy, you have to think about it in terms of his search for his own glory as he defines that, right? And ownership is a big part of it, right? It has to be conquest. It can't be that, I simply got a new lease on parts of Greenland. I have to have conquered Greenland, right? That's how I burnish my glory. And again, I see that as utterly gratuitous, not in the best interests of the nation. And yes, so harmful for no reason.
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was hilarious over the weekend, the news that the Chinese are having delegations with Canada. And I was like, I think I said this on Twitter, but like, who had it? on their bingo card the coming who lost Canada debate, right? I mean, like, for people who don't know, like, who lost China was the question that obsessed foreign policy eggheads for decades. And like Canada, like, I mean, again, I don't think Canada trading with China is the end of the world or anything like that. And I think Trump deserves the FU. I have never been in a position where I am rooting for the foreign critics of the United States as much as I am these days. But we are just in the wrong on the Greenland stuff. We're wrong on the Canada stuff. Venezuela is more complicated. And it's just dishonorable. And we've had a lot of effed up administrations and policies and politics for over my lifetime, right? I was born in the Nixon administration. I always took America's side at the end of the day. Didn't mean I agreed with everything that happened here or anything like that, but like, it's getting harder to say we're right and they're wrong about a lot of things, and it's really troubling. Anyway.
Yeah, I'll just add to that again. I overwhelmingly a Middle East expert. That's what I focus on. And one of the things that's really been striking over the last 6 months in particular is how many Middle Eastern countries, our allies, have been saying, sotto voce, but nonetheless saying that right now Israel is the rogue regime in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's a combination of the fact that, again, Iran has been pummeled. Their ability to cause mischief has been greatly reduced, at least for the moment. And the Israelis are doing all kinds of stuff, right? The Israelis are in their element. Bibi likes, suddenly has decided he likes using force, right? The Israeli strike on Doha was shocking to people all across the Middle East. And by the way, kudos to President Trump. So rarely say this, but I'm going to say it. Kudos to him for forcing Netanyahu to apologize to Qatar for that, because that was very important to get Bibi to understand that, what he did was a huge mistake, which it was. But again, the view in the region right now is that Israel is the rogue regime. Globally, we are the rogue regime.
Yeah.
Right. And, that's never a good thing. Maybe there are folks who, these young guys who think it's fun to be a rogue, and that means you go out and, I don't know, rape and pillage, and they think that's wonderful stuff, right? That's not served the United States well through its history. I don't think it served any country to be seen as a rogue by the rest of the world.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Alas, 90 minutes, not bad. Ken Pollack, thank you so much for doing this. Obviously, we'll be back. We will get to your very strong views on naval history, which you expressed in response to a recent episode, another time. But we can't switch gear. The gearbox will just fly out of the podcast if we switch gears to that right now. So thank you so much for doing this, and of course, we'll have you back.
My pleasure, but your listeners really are going to be impoverished. I don't know how they're going to live their lives without hearing my views on naval history. But if you think they can survive a while longer, I'll trust your judgment, Jonah.
We'll have you back. I guarantee now, like 80% of the email about this podcast is, "You bastard, why didn't you go into naval history?" But we'll deal with that another time. Thank you, sir.